With certain aspects of life out of your control, time you set aside for fun things have to accommodate for that, and that was certainly the case today. Hello folks, and welcome back to another video. Today's date is May 19th, 2025, and I am located at the small CSX rail yard in Fostoria, Ohio, just south of the Iron Triangle Railpark. Today, I was on my way over to the rail park to spend the entire day catching trains. However, before I got to the rail park, I wanted to make a quick stop at the local rail yard to take a look at CSX's newest heritage locomotive, ES44AH 1981, which is painted to commemorate the recently fallen Pan Am Railways. While the entire trip as a whole took about a month to plan due to bad weather, 1981 stuck around Fostoria long enough for me to get this picture, which was relatively easy to get, as 1981 was sitting in a portion of the yard that was accessible from public property. With the first objective completed, I then made my way over to the rail park. I was greeted with an eastbound on the CSX Willard subdivision 20 minutes after my arrival, that being CSX IO18. IO18 is a Saturday through Tuesday intermodal train that operates between Chicago, Illinois and Worcester, Massachusetts, with a very short train of containers and trailers behind the solo leader. Well, folks, they don't call this train the baby ship for nothing. Things were slow to get going on this day, as there was a 30 to 45 minute wait time between the IO18 in the previous scene and the train that's in our next scene. Taking the Northwest Y from the Willard subdivision to the Pennerville subdivision from east to north was CSX I-150. A daily North Baltimore, Ohio to Detroit, Michigan intermodal train. I wanted to do something different with this shot. Instead of sitting alongside the fence, I wanted to briefly pan the camera as I-150 traversed the Northwest Y, similar to how you see on the virtual railfan camera also located here. Only with the ditch lights active, Norfolk Southern quickly stepped onto the plate when local freight L70 departed westbound out of Blair Yard to do their daily work between here and Edgerton, Indiana. This train was a cool catch for me, not just because of the ex-Conrail pair that was assigned to take this train, but the raw display of EMD horsepower, as with a long cut of heavy steel coil cars to take with them, the crew aboard L70 today had to work these two EMDs hard. Control of the interlocking was given back to CSX as another eastbound approaches on the Willard subdivision. With empty high tops and tubs, the only identity this train needs is the Coke Express, or B158, which is one of the few bulk commodity trains that operates on a daily basis. This one operates between the Canadian National Interchange in Gary, Indiana, and the U.S. Steel Mill in Clarendon, Pennsylvania. The Columbus subdivision gets a piece of the action when a northbound loaded coal train popped up on the radar. The train in question is CSX C517, which runs on an as-needed basis out of Quinnamont, West Virginia, bound for the coal docks in Toledo, Ohio, accelerating from a standstill after letting the B158 from earlier cross the diamonds in front of him. It's once again back to the Willard subdivision for another eastbound, specifically a mixed freight train, CSX M560, which runs on a daily basis between Cincinnati, Ohio and Selkirk, New York. At this point, I can say this. I hope you like GEVOs because there's 2 more on this train and definitely plenty more to come. Following closely behind the M560 was another eastbound on the Willard subdivision, that being the red-hot IO-10 that operates on a daily basis between Chicago, Illinois and North Bergen, New Jersey, this being the highest priority train that comes through here. Almost immediately after the passage of IO-10 came an eastbound on the Norfolk Southern Fostoria District, NS 302. a daily mixed freight train that runs between Elkhart, Indiana and Bellevue, Ohio, slowing into town to make a pickup and a drop-off here in Blair Yard. As 302 slowly made his way past the rail park, another eastbound mixed freight train would make its way through on the Fostoria district, that being NS-38N, a daily Decatur, Illinois to Conway, Pennsylvania mixed freight train. 38N was much closer behind the 302 than I initially thought, which unfortunately made me miss the lead locomotive on 38N, but it was being blocked by 302 otherwise, so it really didn't matter all that much. After the double dose of Norfolk Southern trains, once again, the interlocking was given back to CSX when a westbound approached on the Willard subdivision. This one would end up being the loaded counterpart to the B-158 we saw earlier, CSX B-157, coming out of the U.S. Steel Mill in Clarendon, Pennsylvania, back for the Gary, Indiana interchange to the Canadian National. Two more ES-44s would once again take this train. However, the trailing 5434 was still looking pretty clean after a recent repaint. The Pemberville subdivision was pretty quiet most of the time I was here. That was until a southbound popped up on the radar. CSX mixed freight train M567, preparing to take the Northwest Y from south to west, operating on a daily basis between Walbridge, Ohio and Gibson, Indiana, to be handed over to the Indiana Harbor Belt Railroad. After M567 cleared the diamonds, I would then break off to get something to eat for lunch. While doing so, I would end up missing NS 258 and CSX M565, and I would just barely get a clip of the locomotives of CSX M225 as soon as I was returning to the rail park as they were traversing the Northeast Y. For whatever reason, my phone did not want to zoom in as I was sticking it out the window, so this was the best I was able to get, which is quite a shame because we were just getting a brief break from all the GEVO-dominated trains. After M225 cleared the diamonds, I would end up witnessing a perfect meet between two counterpart intermodal trains on the Norfolk Southern Fostoria District, NS 272 and 273. Both trains operate between Landers Yard in Chicago, Illinois, to Portlock Yard in Norfolk, Virginia. with 272 being the eastbound run and 273 being the westbound run. With my time running short, one more westbound would traverse the Willard subdivision before I had to leave for the day, that being CSX I-157, a daily Philadelphia, Pennsylvania to Chicago, Illinois intermodal train. Adding some much-needed variety to the GEVO-dominated trains was the ex-Conrail SD70 mag trailing second, CSX 4582. As I was making my way out of town, the third objective of my trip was then put into action. Stepping off of Class 1 trackage, I would make my way over to the rock quarry that's located here in Cary, which is served by both CSX and the Wheeling and Lake Erie. I haven't seen Wheeling and Lake Erie in almost 5 years, and it's also nothing short of a mystery that I've passed through Cary so many times over the last 10 years on trips to Fostoria, and didn't realize that this regional railroad actually serves the industry here. So, judging by that very specific description, you can probably tell which side I decided to go on. Sitting at the mouth of the yard is a trio of Wheeling and Lake Erie EMD SD40-2s, and all three of these have some pretty colorful history. The leader of this trio, Wheeling and Lake Erie 7026, was originally built in 1979 for the Milwaukee Road. Second in command, Wheeling and Lake Erie 7009, was built in 1986 for the National Railways of Mexico. Last but not least, but partially blocked by the freight cars here in the yard, Wheeling and Lake Erie 7001 was originally built in 1980 for the Union Pacific. As I was taking pictures of this trio, the 7026 immediately caught my attention, not only because of its comparatively shiny paint as opposed to the other two, but it's also wearing the Operation Lifesaver Railroad Crossing stickers. Either way, it's nice to know that this regional railroad serves this industry, as it's a lot closer to me as opposed to going to where their main base of operations are in Akron, which is in the northeastern portion of the state. After taking a look at the Wheeling and Lake Erie, I would then continue my way out of town on my journey home, which is where we now conclude yet another video. For my first big rail fanning trip of the year when it was all said and done, it was a good one. Despite the elephant in the room that most of the trains that I saw during this trip were led by GEVOs. Yeah, seeing GEVOs on every single train that you catch is something that's very heavily frowned upon, and I would be lying to you if I disagreed with that statement, but the bookends to this trip still made it worth coming out here in the first place. If you enjoyed this video, consider checking out some other ones of mine. Leave a like or a comment down below to share your thoughts, subscribe if you're new, and tap the notifications bell if you want to be notified when a new video gets posted here on the channel just like this. Till next time, this is All Ohio Railfan, signing off.